Welcome to this bonus chapter from the Space VFX Elements Series with Gleb Alexandrov and me, Adi Burrows. In this chapter, let's go large, like really large, and attempt a massive nebula cloud fly-through. I think we can do this thing and still be back in time for breakfast. Anyway, let's get stuck into setting up our scene. So this is our default scene. I've split the view already. We've got a node editor down below and we've got the 3D view up top. I've also set it to cycles rendering, and we can now switch our device from CPU to GPU since this graphics card is compatible. Don't worry if yours isn't though, just leave it as CPU. But since we are setting this at GPU, I'm just going to hit F12 to render the image, and you can see this little orange square that's darting around the scene. These are our tile sizes, and you can see at the top here we've got 5.69 seconds to render that. If we come down a little bit down here around the performance area and set this from 64 to a larger tile size, so 512 let's try, and then hit F12 again, we'll see instead of it being 5.69, we now get a render time of 3.07. So we're going to set that up to increase that render time basically. If you set to CPU though, keep that really low, say something like 16. So I'm just going to hit escape and then switch into our rendered view. And you can see as we move around here, the view is a little bit jagged as it tries to calculate what to show us on screen. This is a pretty good resolution for a lot of things, but for now we're actually going to set this fairly high, say something like 256. And now the first thing it tries to show us is a little bit smoother. So we get a lot less of those jagged lines basically. So this object has a material on it already, and I've set it to use nodes, which is why we've got this simple diffuse shader set to a material output, but we don't really need this. So what I'm going to do is select it and press X to delete, and then I'm going to go Shift A and add instead a shader, Emission shader, and then let's drop that in. And we can hook this up like this, or I can control left click and drag through it to destroy that connection. And since we have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, and we're going to need that enabled, we can go control shift and click on it just to automatically hook that up to our material output. So since we're going to be using a lot of emission shaders to pull this effect off, we don't really need that much in the way of sampling. So I'm actually going to left click and drag across these two values and set that down to 1. Also, I'm just going to come down to light paths, and we're not really using any of this stuff, so I'm going to set the bounces down to 0. And the same with all of this. Basically, this is going to be a very simple rendering setup, hopefully to give us as much speed in the rendering as we possibly can. Otherwise, I'm just going to leave all these other rendering options as they are. Let's press Z to toggle the wireframe here and stop it from rendering in the viewport. And we've got this lamp in the scene that we don't really need, so I'm going to right select it and then press X to delete. And here's our camera over here. So let's bring it back to the center of the world by pressing Alt-G. And then let's reset its rotations by pressing Alt-R. And then what we can do is just drag that up a little bit. And instead of this cube, the whole effect is going to hinge on these emissive planes. So what we can do is press X to delete this cube and then go Shift A and add in a mesh plane instead. Our material's gone though, but it's still in the list. We can just left click to open up our pull down menu and select our material back again. Next thing I'll do is just split this view. So I'll left click and drag from the top right there, open that up, and then we can press 0 on the numpad in this view to be able to look through the camera we'll be rendering from. And we can still see a general 3D view on the right hand side. So let's take a look at what we are actually rendering by hitting Shift Z, which is the shortcut key to switch us into our rendered view. And we're a little bit zoomed out, so I'm just going to scroll the mouse wheel in just to tighten that in. And we're also rendering outside of the camera border, which we don't really need to do, as that's going to slow things down for no reason. So let's just come over to the rendering tab of the properties window and hit our little border checkbox. Also, the background is a somewhat depressing mid-grey. Let's just tidy that up. Let's come over to the world tab and we'll set that down to the blackest of black. And for some reason, this kind of reminds me of James Bond. You can go Control 3 to throw a subdivision modifier on there, and maybe you can kind of see what I mean. But anyway, let's just undo that with Control Z. And these black borders here are indicating a bit of a problem because we want to have the camera not be able to see the edges of our plane. So I'm going to select the camera by just right selecting it on this edge here, and then come over to the camera settings, and then our focal length, let's just pull that right up, and you can see it's starting to stretch out in the little graphic icon that we have for the camera. I'm just going to set that up and keep pushing it really far to something like 70, just round that off. This is the sort of focal length that might be a little bit more believable for kind of space objects anyway. And the next thing we can do is select our plane, and let's get a little bit of material for us to be able to see, since this pure white thing is not that inspiring. So let's set up a little bit of a shader here. Let's go Shift A and add in a shader mix shader. Since we have our emission shader, we just want to mix it in with something else. and we'll mix it in with some transparency. So let's go Shift A and add in a shader, transparent shader. Put that on top. Let's plug this one into the top socket, which will bump the other one down into the second socket for us. Now to derive this factor, so at 0 we're going to be fully transparent, and at 1 we're going to be into emission territory again. Let's go and add a noise texture. So texture, noise, and this is the factor output that we can plug into our factor. And where it's black it'll show the first, and where it's white it'll show the second. Thanks to the Node Wrangler add-on, we can go Control-T, and it'll also generate these vector nodes for us. And I'm going to choose the object out and just plug that in instead. And we're probably not going to be using the mapping node just at the moment anyway, so I'm going to go Control-X just to delete that while still maintaining this connection through. And also, now that we have our object out, we don't need to be able to see all these other sockets, so I'm just going to collapse this down with Control-H. And let's just tuck that in a little bit. Also, this tends to be a little bit on the low contrast side, so let's team this up with a converter color ramp, drop that in, and it automatically hooks it up for us. And if we took this up about 20% on either side, so up to 0.2 and down to 0.8, we're just going to increase our contrast a little bit. The next thing I'm going to do is just make this noise a little bit larger, so let's set that down to say something like 1.5, and the detail a bit higher at say 5. So we're still going to maintaining those overall large forms, but we're just, with this detail, we're going to get some more intricacies being thrown into the bargain. So right now, if we select our camera and try and push it through, things get pretty uninteresting pretty quickly. So let's bring that back, and what we want to do is grab our plane, and we want lots of these. But just as we're setting up, let's just get a handful of them so far. So say maybe around 5 to 10 of them. And we can achieve this using our array modifier. So let's come over to the modifiers, go add modifier, array. And it's put it off to the side, which is definitely not what we want. So let's turn off our relative offset and stick it on constant offset instead. And then let's play with our Z value, because it's on the Z axis that we want to push this down. And then if we take that up, it's going to push it towards the camera. So let's push it in the negative direction instead. Something like this. Now at the moment we've only got 2 altogether, so let's set that up as we said to somewhere between 5 and 10. Let's go with 8. And we can see we're getting a bit more into that ghost in the fog with a blizzard background kind of a thing going on. So let's fix a couple of things here. Let's start by taking this color ramp, the black end of things, and what we can do is squeeze this in so we can make a lot more of the space instead of just the clouds. And also we're able to see now a lot more of the borders of our planes again. So let's tab into edit mode and just press S and scale that up until it basically covers the borders of the camera. So it's scaled up by about 4, and then let's just left click to confirm that. And now if we tab back into object mode, select our camera, and now drag that down through the clouds, we can see that we're going to start getting our sort of fly-through effect. Alright, so let's undo that with Control Z. Select our plane, and we'll develop this a little bit further. So let's give ourselves some color variety in here. Right now we've got this almost pure white thing going on. In fact, it would be pure white if I just selected on this emission color value and just tuck that up a little bit. But we don't want that. We want some mysterious blends from one hue to the other. So let's set that up. In fact, it's pretty simple. We just use this noise texture here. Let's go Control Shift D to duplicate it, so we maintain our connection into that object coordinates. And then let's plug our color out into the emission color. Straight away, we've got pretty much what we want. But we do need a little bit more control over this. So for example, the colors are blending from one to the other a little bit too quickly and too short a distance. So let's set the scale of this way lower, like 0.1. And the detail doesn't need to be this high either, so let's just set that down to about 2. That'll speed up our rendering ever so slightly. And then let's go Shift A and add in a color hue saturation node, mostly to use for the saturation slider here. So let's set that down to say something like 0.5. And then to tint the overall color, let's give ourselves a color mix RGB node, drop that in. Let's set this to multiply, and we'll multiply this by white for the minute. So let's take that all the way up, so the RGB values are all 1. So right now, anything multiplied by 1, or itself, in other words, is basically just itself, so it's going to have no change whatsoever. But if we do take this color swatch and lean it towards a color, like say maybe blue, you can see it's going to tint the overall hue into that blue. And now we can use this factor slider here to kind of increase that effect or not. So I'm going to set that down to around 0.3. So let's give ourselves a little bit more space and tuck these shaders in over here. And then one more node, I'll go Shift A and add in a color RGB curves. So basically what this is going to do is allow us to increase the overall contrast. So I'm just going to put in a couple of points here, drag them into position so that we've got roughly kind of an S shape, crush down the darker areas and brighten up the mid to light areas a little bit. And then if we want to, we can use these RG and B splits to be able to push it into maybe slightly into the blue there. And maybe let's drag down the green a bit more and the red a little bit more as well. Maybe the green a touch more than that even. And there we go. So what we've got at the moment is just 8 planes in our scene. We could do with a lot more of these planes to be able to fly through. So let's set this up to about a factor of 10. So we want to times this by 10. So 8 times 10. No surprises, it's 80. Not the trickiest of math sums there. But now we have our 80 planes to be able to fly through. Now the problem with this though is if we come over to our rendering tab and scroll down to the light paths area, here we have our transparency set to minimum and maximum of 8. So once the camera sees the transparency of our 8th plane there, beyond that it's basically just going to fall apart and just render black. But we want to render everything really. So let's take this up to beyond 80. So let's set that up to say 90 for now. And now you can see it fills in a whole bunch of other planes that weren't being rendered a second ago. But we can also see these vertical striped lines, which if we toggle into our wireframe with the Z key, we can see are basically just the borders of our plane. 2 main ways to go about this really is we could actually just fade out the edges, or we could just tab into edit mode and press S and scale out so that it basically encompasses the whole of the view there. Which is probably the easiest way to do it. So let's tab back into object mode, press Shift Z to take a look at our rendering, and then we can make some more tweaks where we can take the look in any direction. Let's start with this area here, the noise texture, which is going into our color amp, which is basically just driving how much of this is transparent. So let's make some larger opaque areas by squeezing in the white side of things. Let's drag that over. And also I'm going to try setting this a little bit lower, say around 0.8, so things are a little bit larger. And then we'll mix this in with something else, which is going to be even larger. So let's go Shift A and add in a color mix RGB node. I'll set this to multiply. And so that the changes update a little bit quicker in the viewport there, I'm just going to scroll the mouse wheel back a little bit just to shrink the amount of pixels that Blender's trying to render for us. And also to help things, I'm going to set the start resolution under the performance. Let's set this down to say 128. So with that, I'm going to grab our noise texture and the color ramp and go Control Shift and D to duplicate it while keeping our vector in. And then let's plug this into the second socket of our multiply node there and turn that all the way up. Now rather than it being exactly the same settings, I'm going to set this slightly differently. So say let's try something like 0.2 and we can make it not quite as harsh a transition by just spreading that out a little bit. Just make it a bit softer on the larger shapes. And then on this one here, let's just drag this over so we have a little bit more filled in. But really this is all going to be down to personal taste. To just give it a little bit more variety of what's happening in general, I'm just going to take up the distortion just a little bit on both of these. And really at this stage, we're going to need to select our camera and we can try and drop it through our planes using this Z-axis. But unfortunately, it looks like our start resolution here in the performance section is still a little bit too high since the viewport isn't really updating in time. So let's set this down to 64. And then left click and drag on this Z-axis again. And now we're basically getting our fly-through effect working quite nicely. But we could still do some pretty decent tweaks and quite large changes overall. Pretty simply as well, no less. So let's come over to our scenes tab and come down to the color management and give this some curve action. So overall, we can just increase the contrast here, similar as we might do with an RGB curves node. So let's left click and drag a point into the curve here and drop that down. And then left click and drag another point, bring them together in an S shape to increase that contrast. It's creating an overall pretty dense blue hue to everything as well. And just to counter that slightly, I'm going to back this off a little bit overall by coming to the blue channel, adding in a point here and just dropping that back a bit. And now let's grab our camera and just take another fly through and see what we've got. So I'm quite liking that, but I think we can increase the exposure a little bit here as well, and that might give us some nicer extent to our overall contrast as well. And with this, it's, as you can probably feel, we could tweak this all day, and it's really just down to personal preference. We have these tools over here. We have the actual array material itself that we could tweak with and get quite large changes with very, very subtle tweaks here. So I encourage you to play around with this to get just the kind of vibe that you want to see. So that's our clouds done with, but let's balance what we have so far with some bright pinpoints of starry light. To do that, we'll use a particle system that can use a plane as an object. So let's go about creating that plane. Let's go Shift A and add in a mesh plane. And then just to make things nice and easy, I'm going to hit the slash or the divide key, depending on how you look at it, on the numpad, and that will enter us into this local view. And also I'm going to stop this from rendering by pressing Z, and that'll toggle the wireframe there. And let's go Shift Z in this view instead. And ta-da! It's not very interesting right now because we don't have a material for it. So let's click on the new there, and let's call this star. And instead of a diffuse shader, let's delete that with the X key and instead use an emission shader. So let's drop that there and then go Control Shift and click on it just to hook that up. And what we're looking for, first of all, is just a small circular point of light. So for that, we'll use a texture, gradient texture. And let's just plug in the factor into the color of the emission for now. And we're using a linear type at the moment, but we want a spherical type instead. But it's slightly off center there. We want that circle to be obviously starting from the very origin point of the plane there. So to do that, we can go Control T to auto-generate these vector nodes. Now we could switch from the default generated coordinates to the object coordinates. And we have our circle in the right place of the plane. We don't need to see the rest of these outputs, so let's go Control H to collapse all that down. And then also, instead of just using the quadratic sphere, which is a slightly nicer fall off in my opinion, I'm going to set that back to spherical and instead control the fall off using a math node. So let's go to the converter math node, drop that in and set that to power. Now a power of 2 is exactly the same as the quadratic sphere, but we can now set this even higher. So let's maybe try something like 6, and it's going to shrink that down but give us more of a fall off between the darkest areas. And we can make that even smaller by setting that up to say something like 8. But I'm going to keep that around 6 and we can always tweak that a little bit later on. So let's press B, border select across them, drag them out. And let's add some other elements to it. So let's give it some streaky like vertical and horizontal stripes to this. Give it the sense of a little bit of a lens flare. Let's go J.J. Abrams on this thing. Let's just grab these, border select across them, go Control Shift and D to duplicate them up. In fact, we don't need a duplicate of that one. So I'm just going to hook that up and delete this one. Bring this up to share between the two. And let's add what we're doing here onto what we've got already. So let's go Shift A and add in a color mix RGB node. Drop that in there. This one can go in the second socket. This one can go in the first. And then this can go into our emission shader like this. Okay, so let's set that to add. And we want to completely add these together. Now we'll take our X scale value and stretch that right out to something like this, and then maybe shrink the y-axis down a little bit. We can kind of pull that out a bit like this, and then we have one of our streaks. So let's just set that to 10 just to round it off, and this one's 0.5. Okay, so that's fine. Let's grab these guys again. Let's border select across all these, Control Shift D to duplicate them up, and I'm going to replace this first socket with the output of this. So let's plug that in there. And then also the output of this is going to simply go into the emission color output. Okay, so we've got basically the same thing happening here going on here again, but what we're going to do is just reverse these. So let's set that to 0.5 and this one to 10, and now we have our star-like shape. Alright, cool. For the moment we have this just coming up to an emission shader, and we don't really want that. So we're going to do what we did with the clouds, in which we're going to couple this emission shader with a transparency shader via the mix shader. So let's go Shift A, add in a shader, transparent shader, put that on top, and then let's add in our mix shader, drop that here, and push this into the top one, which will drop the other one down into the bottom. And instead of it informing the color here now, we're going to inform the factor instead. As you can see, it pretty much doesn't make any real difference. But now we've got this color that we can just maybe switch around and push into whatever we want. And I'm going to leave it somewhere around there. So it's a very slight lean into the red. So that's our plane done with. But now we need to basically just set up the particle system. So I'm going to press the divide key on the numpad again, just to bring us out of that local view. Drag this off to the side. Instead of it being called a plane though, I'm going to call this the particle star. And this plane here is our cloud array. So let's just call that cloud array. Alright, so let's get our particle plane in a particle system. So let's go Shift A and add in a mesh cube. And this can act as our volume, if you like, to place all our planes inside. I'm going to hit 7 on the numpad to take a look from top orthographic view and just scale that cube up so that it's wider than our planes. And then from the side view, let's press 3 on the numpad to jump over to the right orthographic, drag that down to somewhere around there, and then press S and then Z to scale that up on the Z axis. And it should completely encompass all of our planes there, and we can stick all our stars inside. So let's come over to the particle system and click New to create a new one. This one I'm just going to call Star System. And then the number of them can be 1,000 for the moment. Now we want them all to be in the scene right from the start. So we're going to have them finish emitting on the same frame as they start emitting. So we're going to stick them all in at the same time. But we don't want them to die after 50 frames. So I'm just going to take that really high so we don't need to worry about it. And instead of emitting from just the faces, the very edges of our bounds here, if you like, I'm going to set that to be the volume instead. If we hit Alt A now, basically they're going to all fall down, which is not really what we want. So let's shift and left arrow back to the start of the animation and we'll deal with that. So let's come down to the field weights here and set our gravity to 0. And let's try our animation again with Alt A. And now they do all sort of just drift off. So let's fix that. Let's go shift and left arrow back to the start. And then let's come up a little bit and we'll find our velocity area, the normal set to 1. Let's set that down to 0 instead. And make sure we're at the first keyframe with shift and left arrow, Alt A, and then we can see everything's pretty much staying where it should. Okay, so at the moment they're just points, but that's not really what we want. We want stars. Now, often stars are kind of pointy, but that's beside the point. Let's put that particle plane in that we spent all that time on. So let's come over to the rendering area, and first of all it's going to try and render the emitter, the cube that we're using, which we do not want to happen, so I'm going to uncheck that. And instead of using these halos, let's select Object instead, and from the pull down it should be fairly easy to find our particle star. From here I think we can afford to make these a little bit larger, so let's try something like this. And also the random size of them, let's crank that all the way up as well so we get a little bit of variety there. And let's go Shift Z in this view to take a look through the renderable camera. And we don't really see anything. So I think we need some more of these since the clouds are basically obscuring most of them. So let's come to the top of our system settings here, and we've got 1,000 of these. Let's set this up to something like 4,500 maybe. Aha, now a couple of them are starting to pop into view. So let's just correct the orangeness of this. I think seeing them against the clouds here is making me want to come over to here and just tweak the emission color here slightly, maybe lean that more into the blue kind of thing. Alright, so with that we can select our cube again. In fact, let's rename this to the particle system. Come down to the general emitter size, which we can find in a couple of different places, but I'm just going to use this size area here. So let's left click and hold shift just to get some finer control to this. Maybe take that down slightly as well. And then let's select our camera. I'm going to select it in the outliner and let's just drag that through the scene, see what we've got. We've got a few of them whizzing by there. And I think that's an overall a pretty nice effect. The only real last thing to do is just take our camera at the top here, switch this, what we've got down here, to be, say, a dope sheet, and let's go to the first frame, so shift and left arrow. Press I to add in a keyframe. Let's add in keyframes for the location and the rotation. And then let's go to the end of the animation. So let's go shift and right arrow. So we have our 250 frames here. So let's just use the standard default frame range it gives us. And then we'll drag our camera down to somewhere like around, let's see, before it gets too dark and we end up on the outside, maybe to about there. Let's press I and add in another location rotation. But so that it isn't so uniform, let's press R and just rotate around a little bit like this and see if that's a nice effect. Let's go I and input the rotation values there that we've got. And then let's go Shift and left arrow to the start and then press Alt A, and then it'll ramp up, get fast, and then start to slow down again. So to change that, let's just press T to bring up our keyframe interpolation. So by default, it's given us this Bezier. So I'm going to set that to linear instead, so that it's just a smooth, constant speed all the way through. So let's Shift left arrow to the start, Alt A to play, and let's see if we can get a fairly reasonable sense of what we've actually created. All right, one thing that I'm noticing is as the camera turns, the borders of our planes are going to start becoming apparent. So let's select the array, press Tab to enter into the edit mode, and press S to scale it out even further. So something like this. Let's press Tab again to enter back into object mode. Shift and left arrow back to the start again, and then let's press Alt A and see what we have again. So I think that's a pretty nice kind of drift through, but I think really I wouldn't mind the animation being overall a little bit faster. So let's just make it twice as fast by just selecting this end keyframe and dragging that up to say something around 140. And let's go over to the rendering tab and set this to 140 so we can speed it all up overall. So let's go Shift and left arrow back to the start, Alt A again, and then we're getting a little bit more of a swift move through everything now, and I think that's a lot better. The other issue is the fact that these planes that we have with the stars on are kind of spinning around with the camera, and we want these to be kind of always in line with the camera. So something we can do about that is we can select our plane that we have here. We can come over to the Constraints tab, we can add an object constraint to copy the rotation, and we can copy the rotation of the camera, and we can also set the particle system over here. Let's come over to the system settings, and we can also enable rotation here, and now it straightens all those up for us. So if we press Alt A again, we hopefully should have something where the planes always, in fact, let's press Z to toggle the wireframe, since we can see the wireframes of all our planes there. That should allow us to be able to see if everything is sticking in just how we want it. And it is. All right. The next thing I want to make sure is if we select the camera and come over to the camera settings, we can see the clipping range is at 100. So things 100 units away aren't going to be rendered. So let's press 1 on the numpad to enter front view. If we select this particle system and press N to take a look at exactly how large it is, the dimensions are actually above 100. So we want to be able to sort our camera out here. So let's set that up to, I don't know, 10,000 instead. And now we can see we're going to get everything in the view. So let's press Alt A again in this view, just to make sure everything is within the bounds of the camera that we want. And it does look pretty good. So let's go Shift and left arrow back to the start. Press Shift Z to take a look in our rendered view. Press Alt A to take another glance through at what we can see. But again, the performance is a little bit too high. So let's come down to here and find our performance area so that we can get a little bit more off the chain here. Let's go 48. Let's try that, see if that's going to update for us. Still not. Maybe if we just scroll the mouse wheel back a little bit, just shrink down the view a little bit, we can get a little bit more of an update. So that's a bit more workable. So I apologize, it's extremely small, I realize that, but we can get a decent feel for the overall animation. Clearly we're going to need to render this out and just make sure that there aren't anything that is in dire need of a tweak.
Otherwise, congratulations space travelers, we are finished. We have made it to the end of the universe. However, there is one improvement we can make to this by using the distance fade node group from the Space VFX Elements course. This will fade any geometry out as the camera gets closer to it. This way we won't get any sudden sharp transitions as the camera moves from one side of the plane to the other side, which is exactly what's happening here. The creation of the node group is explained thoroughly in the course, as many of you will know, since a lot of people have that course now. Gleb and I have been really blown away seeing all the awesome results you've been sharing with us. Though if you don't yet have the course and therefore don't have this distance fade node group, don't worry, I'll include a link to a blend file with the node group in it for you so you can still add this final step. If you do own the Space VFX course though, you will of course also get access to this Nebula Cloud Project blend file, which you'll have already received in the latest resources pack file. That'll also be the case for future bonus updates that we have planned. So let's add this final step and bring in our distance fade node group. So here I am, back in the project blend file for the clouds fly through, and I've got the camera selected. And if we just come over to around frame 117 or so and just use the left and right arrows, just go one step forward into 118 and then back with the left arrow to 117, you can see this is our area where we have quite a sharp transition. Now with that in mind, we'll select our mesh plane, which is basically our cloud array, and we'll switch this back over to the node editor so we can take a look at our nodes. And all we will need to do really is bring in the distance fade node group, and we'll just drop it in at the very end. So let's bring it into the scene. Let's go File, Append. And then what we want to do is navigate to wherever we have the distance fade blend. Click on it, come over to the node tree, we'll click on the distance fade, and we'll append that from the library. Now when we go Shift A, and we can come down to our group section, we'll find distance fade there, and we can just click and drop it in. Now this distance is actually set quite far away at 30, so it's basically faded out a whole load of what was in front of the camera, which is a bit too far. So I'm going to set this actually quite low to say something like 2. And let's zoom in at the location of where our camera is and just manually grab it. And what we can do is just left click and drag up. And you can see now it's basically fading out and not doing that whole sharp transition thing. So if we just select the planes again, select our distance fade group, press M to mute it, and then grab the camera. Let's just give ourselves a bit more space, and then left click and drag on the Z axis, pop that through, and we can see it just pops at that point. Select the plane again, the array, and then we can unmute this with the M key, and this is where the magic happens. We can take our camera, push it through, and it feels way more natural, and that has to be one of my favorite tricks. It really sells the effect. One more thing we can potentially add this to is the particle star, since that's the only other material that we're using in the scene at the moment. So I'm just going to do exactly as we did with the other, just drop it in at the end here, Shift A to add in the distance fade, and then I'm going to set that really quite low again, so something around 2. And that is basically us complete. All we need to do then is come over to our rendering settings, just make sure we have a decent place to put this. Just render out some PNGs. We don't need to think about alpha because we're not really using it, so I'm just going to switch that over to RGB. Just set the resolution we want, make sure this is set up to 100% when you're doing your finals. Come up to the very, very top and just hit the big old animation button. So that was the final animation, and you can see I've extended it and faded this between some other variations. It's actually quite a lot of fun just making some subtle tweaks, and you can get some really quite different moods. Alright everybody, so this has been 80 Burrows from cgmasters.net as part of the Space VFX Elements Series with Gleb Alexandrov from Creative Shrimp. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more from the Space series, visit either creativeshrimp.com or cgmasters.net, watch the trailer, see what you think, and I'll see you out there on the other side.